Listen, first of all, I don't imagine that there was anything in the MB report that particularly surprised you.
No, there's a whole bunch of these scenario reports done by a lot of different people in the industry, and they all move in a very similar kind of direction. Their best guesses in what's a really rapidly changing sector. And so they come up with a range of different scenarios. They try and tease out the implications of things. What if there is a massive take-up of EVs, say, or what if we start using a lot of hydrogen? And they just develop different models to give you that kind of range of potential numbers.
Because the thing it was got a great deal of coverage, that report. I think everybody looked at it, and I imagine most people, as a layperson, your reaction is, God, we almost have to double our electricity generation to meet future need. Where's that coming from? Is there a particular political or ideological framework that drives these estimates?
Some of the work was in the last few years was done quite deliberately to try and test how feasible the idea of getting to 100% renewables would be, and so that kind of drives a certain set of questions. A lot of these reports are actually done by the electricity sector themselves, so they inherently have a bias. And I remember Transpower did the first of their big studies back in 2018, and they came up with some, this sort of doubling of demand forecast from electricity. And it was completely wrong. It really just had overshot. It was ahead of what anybody else thought. And a couple of years later, they had to backtrack because they recognised that, for industry, a lot of, efforts to reduce emissions would actually be done through things like biomass, not just...
Yeah, that's right. I remember that. Yep.
As a starting point. So, you always have to look at these reports with a little bit of scepticism as to, as you say, what the underlying ideologies or technical preferences are, technology preferences are. But I mean, the broad direction is pretty much the same with all of them now. Most of them are pretty close. I mean, the MB report, it offered a range of sort of demand growth, and that was from sort of like 35% growth up to that 82% growth that you mentioned. But the middle figure, picking demand to get to about 62 terawatt hours, that's like sort of 55% increase. That's pretty much in line with most of the other reports if you look at them. So yeah, that's probably the number to focus on. If you give much weight to two reports that are trying to guess the future in 30 years.
Well, and then that's the other thing. That's really difficult to do, obviously, as well. But the closure of the Marsden Point oil refinery in 2022, Gavin, meant that we now import most of our, obviously all our petrochemicals in terms of heating as well, and not and running our cars, etc. How vulnerable does that make us to overseas fluctuations? Much more, less more, doesn't make any difference? Was Marsden Point critical to having some sort of control over the energy market in this country?
It doesn't really alter our exposure because we were always exposed through the oil price. So we would import crude oil, which we paid an international price for. Now we just import made-up product. So that sort of security, that sort of risk or price risk aspect hasn't really changed because of the refinery's closure. I think we've lost a lot of optionality about how we might use that site in future, and we've lost a lot of jobs, obviously, which for no emissions benefit. But those, slightly different issues, aren't they?
Okay. All right, now, renewables. The MB report says that, don't worry, we've got particularly wind power and we've got solar on the horizon as renewables. it essentially is quite sort of optimistic that by 2040, I think they mentioned something like 92% of New Zealand electricity generation will be renewable. Also, geothermal will be cranked up and things like that. Does that strike you as realistic?
I was actually reasonably reassured in the report just how much focus they had on the report on the need for gas. Because if you think about the growth they're projecting in electricity demand overall, they're saying that yes, renewables will meet most of it, but we're still going to need gas backup, and that's pretty sensible and entirely kind of what you'd expect, particularly because the renewables that are being built will be mostly wind and solar, and they are intermittent. So there is that aspect, but they also tried to address the point that you were getting to, this winter demand peak, how we actually meet it, because our winters are becoming more peaky, and that's the one time that you need the most backup. Because just in recent days, you've probably noticed this, we've had a couple of really cold, still days.
Oh, more than a couple, an entire month off. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, we've had cold weather, but most days of the week we're getting quite strong wind. But as soon as that wind drops away, power prices go through the roof, and that's the consequence of actually managing the intermittency.
So when you talk about power prices going through the roof when we get still winter days, you're talking about it's colder, so there's more consumption, or the turbines don't turn. If there's any solar power, the sun's interrupted, the generation capacity drops, or both.
Well, it's both. So cold, obviously, boosts your demand. Solar is much better in this regard, because you're going to get some solar. Even on a cloudy day, you'll still have some juice coming through your solar panels. But with wind, it is so variable. And I remember the other day, normally I come into the office and 7 o'clock-ish, and I'll look at, what the demand is on the system. And some days you can have sort of 800 megawatts of wind, all the turbines are powering away. You come in tomorrow and it might be about 100. I left the office the other night. I was just curious because, the temperature was dropping in Wellington, and I didn't see much wind out there, and I just looked on the Transpower site, and we had about 26 megawatts of wind. So we have about almost 1,300 megawatts of wind turbines out there, and just at that particular time, they were producing 26 megawatts, and that's the kind of variability the system has to be able to cope with.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Listen, the thing I've always been curious about, hydro is sort of the centrepiece of electricity generation, or renewable electricity generation in this country. And I live in an area surrounded by man-made lakes and by hydro. So I live in the Waitaki, sort of Tekapo, Pukaki, Clyde Dam sort of area.
Yep.
And so, well, but it also, the fascinating part is that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, these projects were built, and how critical they are to the energy infrastructure of this country and to the economic infrastructure of this country. Surely, and every time I drive past them, I think to myself, why haven't there been more? Why aren't there more dams in this country, or construction of, that you would think, a couple of dams like Clive, or the Waitaki ones, which were Benmoe, Avimore, Waitaki, that would create such an enormous amount of electricity, you would think, and you would think deal with all future demands. Can you explain that to me?
I can try. One of the issues in New Zealand, we did have plans for more hydro on the Twitter scheme particularly. There was a series more of the dams planned down the chain out towards the coast. But they were just considered unconsentable in the end. And there's also a cost issue because the cost of wind and solar keeps falling so rapidly. I mean, as you say, big dams can play a huge role, particularly if you think about it. If you're putting a dam on the same part of the river, you're just making more juice out of the same amount of water as it flows down the cascade.
Well, the Waitaki is a great example of that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Waikato system too, if you think about it.